Hi, I'm Clare.
Hi, I'm Zim. We're academics from the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Deakin.
We're here today to answer your burning questions about the US election and its possible impact on Australians or how they're feeling about it.
To begin, let's ask about endorsements. Clare, what is the impact of cross-party endorsements such as Dick Cheney's support for Kamala Harris, and why might Bush not endorse her?
Good questions. They've been pretty significant, at least as far as social media goes, particularly the endorsement of former Vice President Dick Cheney, who was, the architect of the war in Iraq and all kinds of things in the early 2000s. So the fact that he, a really staunch Republican and a hawk, has endorsed Kamala Harris is really significant. However, for him it's personal. His daughter Liz Cheney, of course, opposed Donald Trump's election and has lost her seat as a result. Bush has not endorsed anyone since 2016. He is not a fan of Trump, but he will not endorse the other side. And in 2020, in fact, I learned just recently, he wrote in for the presidential race the name of Condoleezza Rice, his former Secretary of State, rather than voting for either of the candidates.
Very interesting.
So Zim, how would you describe the communication styles of the candidates? What has worked and what has not?
Well, I think their communication styles are contrasting. Donald Trump emphasizes confrontation. He uses conspiracy theories. He's weak on truthful claims, and he uses a lot of falsehoods to make his points, which are often dramatic and they get the media's attention. Kamala Harris, I would describe her as having a prosecutorial style. Again, can be very engaging and confrontational, but I think over time her style has broadened, so she's become better at articulating a vision. We saw that in the most recent debate, where she was able to articulate new policies and more generally link her personal experiences to her campaign, which I think she did relatively successfully. I think that the success of their strategies is an interesting question. On the one hand, I think it's clear that Kamala Harris's style is more aligned with what you would describe as the normative ideal of a candidate, extolling policy positions and presenting the electorate with choices to choose between. Donald Trump's style is normatively less desirable for reasons such as his willingness to parlay the truth and willingness to engage in blatant falsehoods. Now, that's the normative standard. The more practical question is, which is the winning strategy? And I think that's more difficult to determine at this point because however we view Donald Trump's communication style from a normative standpoint, it's self-evident that he has plenty of supporters who see value in how he communicates.
Yes.
Clare, what do you think is at stake in this election? If Trump wins, what are your predictions for America's future? And what if Harris wins?
Trump is very closely associated, whether he says he is or not, with Project 2025, which is a manifesto of some 1,000 pages that lays out a future for the United States that will roll back all kinds of measures for equity, civil rights, basically, and will further entrench wealth, which is already very heavily entrenched in the United States in the top 1% or 10%. So that is some of the future. I mean, I think some of the dystopian claims about the possible sort of nation that you would see under Donald Trump are not that far-fetched. He did a very good job in his first term of dismantling much of the public service. And with the recent Supreme Court decisions that would aid this enormously, we could see the end of the Environmental Protection Authority, for example, even the Department of Education. All of those things will be radically scaled down. Lots of powers returned to the states or given to the states. So, in that kind of environment, it could be entirely different from what we've known until now. And I think mass deportations would not be off the cards. So, as a historian, I can see echoes of the 1930s in Europe in some of what Trump is saying he would do or others are predicting he would do. Harris, I think we would have, to use your term, more normative time of things. She's no radical. She's unsurprisingly, she's fairly conservative for a Democrat, or even just generally speaking, which is not surprising because to be the woman of colour who is the first likely, or possible president, of course she's conservative, but that's the way it works. So I don't think we'd be seeing a, nationalisation of the railways anytime soon. But I would hope there'd be some restoration of the rule of law that has been eroded in the last couple of terms, and, well, not so much under Biden, of course, but under Trump and with the Supreme Court. And at best, I would hope that she would expand the Supreme Court. But that's me hoping, perhaps more than predicting.
Interesting speculations.
All right, Zim, what's your read on how Australians are viewing this election?
My read is that Australians seem to be very interested in this election. The ABC commissioned a poll that was produced some very interesting results that suggested that Australians are broadly in favour of a Harris presidency by a significant margin. I think it was around 60% to 30 or 35%. Now, there are quite a few interesting nuances on that poll, including the fact that while Australians obviously vary in terms of their political positions, the supporters of every political party, except for Pauline Hanson One Nation, would favour Harris as president, which in a sense suggests that there's really broad opinion support for Harris and the messages that she elaborates, and also a dislike of Trump across the supporters of all political parties. That said, I think another interesting observation from that poll is the fairly significant rump of Australians who are quite open to the idea of a Trump presidency, who would welcome that ahead of a Harris presidency. And I think that's instructive for the Australian political system, because it suggests the potential for the right kind of populist to do fairly well in this environment, perhaps better than we would normally expect. Clare, building on that question, how do you think Australian perceptions of the United States and its political system have evolved over recent years?
Because Australia tends a bit closer to the centre-left than the United States does, at least in terms of things that we really value, even among coalition voters. Medicare, for example, is treasured by a majority of Australians. And there is a kind of smugness about a lot of Australians' views of the United States. Guns, it's crazy, why can't they just fix that? Why does healthcare cost so much? Of course, that has been remedied, in great part by what used to be called Obamacare. So, I think Australians have a kind of sense that in some respects we do democracy better than Americans do. The compulsory voting is another one, and the endless celebration of the democracy sausage, which, it is a kind of lovely thing that in Australia it's become an important ritual, and you take your kids to the local school and you buy your sausage, which of course is raising money for that school that's underfunded. But, it is an important civic duty, and people tend to take it, well, they do it in huge numbers. So there's a kind of smugness, and I think the extremities that Trump has brought to the American system have played into that. So Australians are pleased not to see too much of that here, although, as you say, a 35% polling result saying that they would be fine with a Trump presidency suggests that, there's always the danger of a move into authoritarian politics. So I think that's one reflection on how Australians view the American political system. I really think one of the most, I can't speak for all of Australia, of course, but I think that compulsory voting is a really big part of how we think about the differences between our two places. Is it useful for Kamala Harris to try to correct misinformation and conspiracy theories, even if they are unlikely to change the views of far-right voters?
Interesting question. So, as I mentioned earlier, Trump trades in conspiracism. This is one of his signature communication styles. So how should Kamala Harris counter this particular tactic that Trump uses? And it's not just Trump, it's also a lot of his elite level supporters. J.D. Vance has admitted, of course, to engaging in conspiracism on a mass scale as well. So the obvious tactic is for her to try and rebut the conspiracism with facts and evidence and say, look, Donald Trump, you are lying. You are misleading the public on this point. The problem, of course, is that many people who are supporting Trump don't believe her when she says that. They believe Trump. So this, in a sense, puts her in a box. It's very, very difficult for her to persuasively rebut people who support Trump in a highly polarized environment. So what can she do instead? Well, I think there's a few other options that are, if you like, less confrontational and potentially tactically more effective. So one of them we might describe as a qualified embrace. And by that I mean that what she might try to do is, rather than attacking the conspiracism outright, attacking the claim, although you don't have to admit it's true, you emphasize the sources, the reasons why people might believe a false claim. And typically those are reasons to do with inequality, to do with marginalization, to do with hurt pride. And I think she's got a really powerful message when it comes to those issues. And she can speak about the policies that she's got that can help to deal with the underlying sources and places from which the support for conspiracism emerges. I'd also add, just on the point of how to deal with conspiracism, there's a very important role for the media in all of this. And one of the noteworthy things about the last debate was the willingness of the moderators to intervene, to check Donald Trump and challenge him whenever he...
They are not eating the dogs?
No, they are exactly. The Haitians are not eating the dogs, which needed to be said, right? Because these things are like wildfire. They can spread very quickly. And they're being purposefully seeded by Trump and J.D. Vance. So, yeah, there's an array of actors who have to be involved in trying to keep the information environment clean and tolerable for democratic discourse.
So when you say qualified embrace, when Harris said at the very beginning in her opening statement in the last debate, I will be the president for all of middle-class America, which, an awful lot of people think they're middle-class in the United States. Nobody wants to say that they're working class. Is that what she's doing there? Is she trying to signal to people that she understands that they might be tempted by Trump and his theories? Do you think that's what she's doing?
I think what she's doing there is a very shrewd tactic at many levels. It's a good tactic in response to conspiracy theories. It's a very good tactic, and I suspect this might be the grander motivation, whenever you're a woman of color and people, by virtue of those facts, by that identity, find you threatening. And the first thing you want to do is lower the public cortisol level and basically tell people, look, I'm a unifier. I'm not a divider. Because I think, something that she learned from the Clinton campaign is that it's very risky, even if you think you're going to divide the country in ways that generate a majority, it's very risky to run a campaign on those terms if you're a minority. Much better to do what Obama did, which is to play the role of the unifier. And in a sense, as you were pointing out earlier, you said conservative, in another way, the conservatism is found in what she doesn't emphasize. And that's her race, her identity. She plays that down a little bit and leaves it for other people to talk about the significance of her identity for the campaign and for American history. So I think by playing that down, she's signaling, look, I'm every man, every woman American as well. Which I think is quite interesting.
I think that's very astute. And I think the way that her campaign has managed that from the very, very beginning, from that Sunday afternoon, has been, it's a revelation, actually. And as if they were quite well prepared, actually.
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely. And I think in a way, emerging out of the shadow of Joe Biden helps with that, because this is where Biden is strong.
Yes.
Right? That,
yes.
Even if he struggled to speak during a debate, many Americans can identify with him. And he certainly was in 2020 a unifying candidate. And so I think that unity, division, cleavage is something that she's been able to run with and is a clear contrast with Trump. What lessons should we glean from the current US election for our thinking about Australian politics?
Well, that figure you quoted earlier of 35% of people polled by the ABC being perfectly content with a Trump outcome, success, suggests that we need always to be cautious and to caution against or to guard against the rise of authoritarian leadership. And there was another interesting study done by colleagues at ACU and the ANU that was published in The Guardian over the week, or the results were published in The Guardian over the weekend, that showed it's local government where the people with the most extreme views are coming in to run for office in bigger numbers. So there were 120 that they identified in the New South Wales local elections last weekend who are libertarian.
Bubbling away at the grassroots level.
Exactly. So there's a bit of it there. So that's, I mean, anyone who knows history knows that you have to guard against this all the time. But yeah, if it can happen there, it can happen here.
Yeah, for sure.
But I mean, I wonder if there are some less cataclysmic lessons that we could take from US politics as well. One of them probably is some justifiable pride in the voting system and especially in the Australian Electoral Commission.
Yes.
There is no equivalent in the United States. I remember being just astonished to learn that Brian Kemp, who was then Secretary of State in Georgia, the state, was running for governor and was in control of the election in which he was running. I mean, to us, that just seems less than ideal. Let's say less than ideal.
Yeah.
So
only in America.
Well, no, patently not. But
well, amongst the advanced democracies.
Yes, yes, that is true. Yeah. So, so I think there are some. I think that. I mean, in the end, it comes down to civics education and people knowing that we have these kind of things that we should treasure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I've got one last question for you, which is, breaking news for us today. But decades without political violence directed at a presidential candidate has been rocked by two, it seems, assassination attempts on Donald Trump's life. What does this indicate about the current state of American politics to you?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting moment in terms of political violence and its opposite, if you like, political stability. The United States has had a fairly rocky history, if you think about it, in the long term when it comes to political violence. I mean, this idea that the United States and political violence don't go hand in hand is, I think, a relatively a new congruence, a new correlation. We only need to go back to the 1960s when there were riots outside the Democratic Convention in 1968, assassinations of Martin Luther King, candidates on the campaign trail on the Democratic side. Political violence in the 1960s was fairly common. Going further back in history, we see presidents have been assassinated. Political violence occurs from time to time in American political life. And we find that it occurs particularly during periods of intense polarization. So political violence is closely related to how political elites and the people who follow them interact in the public square. When civility disappears, violence enters that vacuum. So the periods in American political life when comity, collegiality, civility characterize elite interactions, we find lower levels of that kind of inter-party strain, lower levels of polarization, and political violence dissipates. And then obviously whenever tensions are stoked by the rhetoric of politicians, by their actions, by their unwillingness to speak civilly to each other, violence returns. So violence is, to use a social sciencey term, it's a variable in American politics. It's not a constant. It's not been low and then suddenly it's high now. It ebbs and flows, and it ebbs and flows in response to polarization, which of course itself is a response to other drivers. But we're in a polarized era. And therefore, it's unfortunately probably not so surprising that political violence has emerged as a facet of American politics again.
Thank you. So that's it from us on the US election, at least for this week. Plenty of news to come. And thank you for being with us.
Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you find interest in the rest of the race.